It had been a long day at work, and as I stepped into the house, the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla greeted me. The faint hum of a video game echoed from upstairs, probably Chris, my stepson, losing himself in his virtual world again. I smiled to myself. He reminded me so much of his father when he was younger, carefree, always lost in a moment. Chris had just turned 20, and his girlfriend, Megan, had been spending more and more time here. She was polite, energetic, and confident, the kind of girl you couldn't help but like, even if her presence sometimes made me feel a little old and out of place. My husband, Mark, was still at work, as usual. His long hours were a staple of our marriage, something I had accepted years ago. Tonight was shaping up to be like any other, a quiet dinner, some Netflix, and an early bedtime. But as I carried the folded laundry upstairs, I had no idea how drastically my perception of this ordinary life was about to change. The door to Chris's room was ajar, light spilling out into the dim hallway. I paused, intending to drop his clothes off on the chair inside, but the sight in front of me froze me mid-step. Chris was on his bed, shirtless, with Megan straddling him, her hands running through his hair. They didn't notice me, they were too caught up in their own world. I should have left right then. I should have quietly shut the door and walked away. But I didn't. Something rooted me in place, a strange cocktail of shock, embarrassment, and something I couldn't name. My heart raced as Megan tilted her head back, her laughter filling the room. It wasn't just the scene that caught me off guard, it was the intimacy, the youthful, unrestrained passion they shared, so unlike what Mark and I had anymore. Finally, I moved. The door creaked as I stepped back, and Megan's eyes darted toward me. She gasped, pushing herself off Chris. He scrambled for a shirt, his face flushing crimson. "Oh my God," Megan said, pulling a blanket around herself. We didn't mean to." "It's fine," I stammered, heat rushing to my face. "I didn't see anything. Just, close the door next time." I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. My hands trembled as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. What had just happened? And why couldn't I stop thinking about it? The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I avoided going upstairs again, opting instead to sit in the kitchen with a glass of wine. I tried to push the image out of my mind, but it lingered, vivid and unshakable. It wasn't the first time I'd stumbled across something awkward. Teenagers were bound to push boundaries, but this felt different. When Megan came downstairs to grab a drink, she hesitated in the doorway. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. I hope we didn't, upset you." "It's fine," I said, waving it off. "Really? Just be more careful next time." She smiled, a little too knowingly for my comfort. "Thanks. You're cool about this." "A lot cooler than my mom would be." I forced a laugh. "Well, don't make me regret it." She laughed, too, a light, airy sound that lingered in the air long after she had gone back upstairs. When Mark came home later, I barely mentioned the incident. "Kids being kids," I said with a shrug. He chuckled and changed the subject, launching into a monologue about work. But even as I nodded along, my thoughts drifted back to Megan's laughter and the strange flutter of something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The following morning, I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had happened. I prepared coffee, read the news on my tablet, and waited for Mark to leave for work. He kissed me on the cheek absent-mindedly. When Megan came downstairs, she was wearing one of Chris's oversized hoodies, her hair messy, but charmingly so. She gave me a sheepish smile, as though testing the waters. "Morning," she said, her voice light. "Morning," I replied, focusing on my coffee. "Sleep well?" She hesitated, then laughed softly. "Yeah. Well, mostly." I looked up at her, and she held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. There was something in her eyes, a hint of mischief, or maybe curiosity. I wasn't sure which, but it made my stomach tighten. Chris came down shortly after, his usual awkward self, muttering a quick "hey" before grabbing a bowl of cereal. The three of us sat in relative silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance Megan cast my way, and every casual movement she made. The day dragged on, and by evening, I was mentally exhausted. Megan had left around lunchtime, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the memory of her lingering gaze or the way she'd smiled at me that morning. It was unsettling, but also intriguing. When Chris and Megan returned later that evening, they went straight to his room. I told myself I wouldn't think about it, wouldn't let my imagination wander. But when I heard their laughter drifting down the stairs, something inside me stirred again, unbidden. I poured myself another glass of wine, telling myself it was just to unwind. The house felt too quiet, even with their muffled voices upstairs. It was as though I was waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. The next time Megan came downstairs, it was just the two of us. Chris had gone to take a shower, leaving her alone in the living room. She plopped onto the couch across from me, tucking her legs beneath her. "You don't mind me being here so much, do you?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Of course not," I said. She shrugged, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Just checking. Some people can be weird about this kind of thing." "What kind of thing?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She tilted her head, studying me. "You know. Sharing a house, sharing spaces. It's intimate, isn't it?" I felt my cheeks flush. "I suppose so." Her smile widened, and she leaned back, looking entirely too comfortable. "You're different, though. You're not like other moms I've met. You're cool." "Cool?" I echoed, laughing nervously. She nodded, her eyes sparkling. "Yeah. It's a good thing. Trust me." Before I could respond, Chris returned, and the moment was gone. But the way she looked at me lingered, like a whisper in the back of my mind, impossible to ignore. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Mark snored softly beside me. Sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Megan's smile or the curve of her figure flashed in my mind, uninvited but persistent. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just a harmless crush, if that's even what it was. Still, the unease gnawed at me. The next morning, Chris had already left for work by the time I came downstairs. Megan, however, was still there, seated at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee. She was scrolling through her phone, but looked up as I entered. "Morning," she said, flashing that familiar smile. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. She gestured to the coffee pot. "Made some for you, too." I nodded in thanks, pouring myself a cup. The silence between us felt charged, though I couldn't tell if it was just in my head. Megan broke it first. "You know," she began, her tone casual but deliberate, "I've been meaning to say." She rested her chin in her hand, studying me. "No, I mean it. You're different. Most people wouldn't have handled what happened the other night as gracefully as you did." I didn't know how to respond to that. The memory of that evening resurfaced, bringing with it a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Megan's gaze didn't waver, and I felt myself squirm under the intensity of it. "It's nothing," I said finally, taking a sip of coffee. "Let's just forget about it." She leaned back in her chair, a sly smile playing on her lips. "If you say so." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but the tension lingered, unspoken but palpable. By the time Megan left, I felt drained, as though I'd been holding my breath the entire time she was in the room. Over the next few days, I found myself both dreading and anticipating Megan's visits. She had a way of drawing me in, of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Mark was as busy as ever, and our conversations had become little more than logistical exchanges about bills or schedules. Megan, on the other hand, seemed genuinely interested in me, in my thoughts, my feelings. One afternoon, I was in the garden, trimming the hedges, when Megan appeared at the back door. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Need a hand?" she asked. "Sure," I said, though I wasn't sure what she could do to help. She grabbed a pair of gloves and joined me, chatting as we worked. Her laughter was infectious, and I found myself relaxing in her presence. For a moment, it felt like we were just two friends, enjoying each other's company. But then her hand brushed mine as she reached for the clippers, and the air between us shifted. Our eyes met, and for a split second, it felt like the world had stopped. Megan was the first to look away, a small, almost shy smile tugging at her lips. Sorry, she murmured, though she didn't sound. That evening, as I replayed the moment in my mind, I realized that a line had been crossed. I just didn't know how to go back. The next week passed in a blur. Megan's visits to the house felt more frequent, though I couldn't be sure if it was just my imagination. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension. I found myself looking forward to her presence in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. One evening, Chris had got out with friends, leaving Megan and me alone in the house. She wandered into the kitchen as I was finishing the dishes, leaning casually against the counter. "Quiet night," she remarked. "It is," I replied, trying to focus on the soapy water and not the way her shirt clung to her frame. "Chris should be back soon, though." She shrugged. "No rush. It's nice, just the two of us." I froze, my hands submerged in the sink. "Megan." "Relax," she said, stepping closer. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable." "You're not," I lied, my voice shaky. She smiled knowingly. "Good. Because I like spending time with you." Before I could respond, she reached out and touched my arm, her fingers lingering. The gesture was simple, but it sent a jolt through me. I turned to face her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Megan, we can't." "Why not?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "What are you so afraid of?" I couldn't answer. My mind raced with 1,000 reasons why this was wrong, but none of them seemed to matter in that moment. Megan's gaze held mine, her expression a mixture of curiosity and determination. Just then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Chris's voice called out, and we both stepped back as if burned. Megan gave me a small, almost apologetic. This was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The following days were fraught with tension. Megan acted as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the guilt that clung to me like a shadow. Mark noticed my distracted state and asked if everything was okay, but I brushed him off with a vague excuse about work stress. Chris, oblivious as ever, continued to spend his time with Megan, their laughter echoing through the house. I found myself avoiding her as much as possible, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in my bedroom, Megan knocked on the door. She entered without waiting for a response, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "Megan, She held up a hand, cutting me off. "I know this is complicated. But I can't pretend I don't feel something here. And I don't think you can, either." I stared at her, my mind racing. "This isn't right," I said finally. "It's not fair to Chris or to Mark." "What about what's fair to you?" she asked, stepping closer. "When was the last time you let yourself feel something real?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Megan reached out and took my hand, her touch sending a shiver down my spine. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," she said softly. "But don't shut me out. Please." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I pulled my hand away. "You should go," I whispered. She hesitated, then nodded, leaving the room without another word. As the door closed behind her, I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. I had no idea what to do. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as they could be. Megan continued to visit, but our interactions were careful and guarded. Chris remained blissfully unaware, and Mark continued with his usual routine, oblivious to the tension that simmered beneath the surface of our home. At first, I thought distance would solve everything. If I could just avoid Megan and let things settle, life would move on like it always had. But avoidance proved impossible. Megan's presence lingered in every corner of the house, her laughter echoing from Chris's room, her scent faintly clinging to the cushions in the living room. Even when she wasn't there, I felt her. One Saturday afternoon, Chris and Mark had gone out to run errands, leaving me alone in the house. I thought I had the day to myself, a rare moment of peace. But then the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Megan stood on the porch, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "Is it okay if I come in?" I hesitated, but stepped aside. Chris isn't here, I said, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. I know, she replied, slipping past me. I came to see you. Her words sent a jolt through me, but I tried to mask it. What do you want, Megan? She turned to face me, her eyes steady. I wanted to talk. I hate how things have been between us lately. There's nothing to talk about, I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. Isn't there? She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving mine. You've been avoiding me, and I get it. I really do. But I'm not the only one who felt something. Am I? I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned away, walking into the kitchen. You should go, I said, my voice trembling. I'll go, she said, following me. But only if you look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel anything. The room fell silent, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Megan's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant to make things harder for you. Her apology caught me off guard, and for a moment, my anger dissipated. You didn't, I said quietly. It's not your fault. She took a tentative step closer. Then what is it? Why does it feel like we're both running from something we don't have to? I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. Because it's not right, Megan. No matter what we feel, it's not right. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded. I understand. She turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. For what it's worth, I'll always care about you. And I hope you find what you're looking for. I didn't respond. I stood there, listening as the front door clicked shut behind her. When I was finally alone, I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. Relief and regret warred within me, leaving me drained and uncertain. Life went on. Megan's visits became less frequent, and when she did come over, we kept our distance. Chris never noticed the change, and Mark remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had unfolded right under his nose. In time, the ache faded. The memories of Megan's smile, her touch, became less sharp, like photographs left out in the sun. But they never disappeared completely. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Mark was asleep beside me, I'd think about her. About what might have been if things were different. If I were different. But life isn't about what might have been. It's about what is. And what was, for me, was a family I loved, a life I'd built, and a choice I had to live with. Megan had been a spark, a reminder of something I'd lost along the way. But she wasn't mine to